Hi everyone, thanks for coming out today. It's one of my favorite events in the IA's calendar. Last year I got to speak about one of my two favorite topics, the National Health Service. As we speak, there are protesters in Westminster claiming that apparently £20 billion a year is not enough funding for the NHS. When that will end, I don't know. This year I get to speak to you about my other favorite topic. It might actually be my favorite, because I think that the factual arguments in favor of women's success, especially working women today, really outweigh all the victimhood narrative out there, and also because when you talk about it, people get really, really riled up. So hopefully for the next 30 minutes, we'll all get riled up together and we can have an interesting conversation about it. I'm going to talk to you about the gender pay gap and the way that the gender pay gap has gripped the developed world, become really, it seems, one of the most commonly spoken about topics of the past few years. I know I don't need to explain what this movement is to you. It's everywhere. I think the Me Too movement started out really strong. It was organic. It was understandable. It was relatable to many women, and it was serious. We were talking about the very, very serious topic of sexual assault and rape. And of course, it popped up during the allegations of against Harvey Weinstein, which were numerous and overwhelming and horrifying. And then women all over the world, without being asked, without being told, just started weighing in about their own experiences about how men and women are still not equal, especially when it comes to assault and domestic abuse statistics in 2018. It was meaningful. I supported it. And then that went away really quickly. Me Too faded. It got hijacked. It disappeared from its original meaning of supporting women in our physical safety. And it turned into something outrageous and silly and significantly less meaningful. All of a sudden, you see #MeToo connected to the Grid Girls debate, trying to persuade Formula One to get rid of women who actually show up fully clothed to their events, wear heels, look pretty, and apparently this was truly offensive, something that had to go in the name of the Me Too movement. You had David Schwimmer, a famous actor, most known from Friends, who was being applauded for offering female professionals chaperones when he was inviting them for meetings, because this apparently was what Me Too meant. It meant we were going back to the Victorian era, when women actually had to have chaperones in order to speak to men. You had Carrie Gracie in the massive BBC furor over the gender pay gap. It was just news yesterday that she's given her payout, which when you read the fine detail wasn't actually connected to gender. It was connected to a clause in her contract about moving into a different pay band. She's decided to give her payout to the Fawcett Society, claiming that it's going to be set up for a fund for women who need legal advice on equal pay. That seems reasonable to me. And it's going to support Fawcett's strategic legal work. This is a bit more concerning to me. The Fawcett Society publishes the Equal Pay Day report every year, claiming that women are going to work for free until the end of the year because of the gender pay gap. Last year's report left off the one region in the UK, Northern Ireland, that had a positive gender pay gap in favor of women. Just left that one out, wonder why. And then lastly, we have Matt Damon, who had the audacity to say that he supported the Me Too movement. He thought it was important, but we needed to be careful not to conflate, as he says, patting someone on the bum and rape or child molestation. The response to this was his co-star Minnie Driver branded him as systematically part of the problem for daring to say that there were different issues here that we should treat in different ways. And I think all of this completely negates what most women actually care about in 2018, which is true equality in the workplace, in the streets, and in the home. It gets drowned out by cries of victimhood and strange campaigns like #PayMeToo, which is more or less offensive to try to piggyback on top of the Me Too movement, because the gender pay gap is not what most campaign groups would have you believe. When we actually look at the facts, when we look at the official data from the ONS, we see that women are doing better than ever before. The full-time workers' gender pay gap is 9.1%, meaning there's a 9.1% pay gap between men and women on average. That's the median calculation for hours worked. It's the most specific you can get basically when you're not including any other meaningful data, which we'll come on to later. The part-time pay gap is negative 5.1%, meaning women on average are earning 5.1% more than men. When we actually start breaking it down into age group, women between the ages of 22 to 39 are doing extremely well. There is a negligible gender pay gap. It usually fluctuates within 3%, so really statistically insignificant. A few years ago, women were actually earning more in these age groups. So pretty much we can say that one's been solved. The changes in the pay gap come later. That 9.1% figure and negative 5.1% figure, they don't take into account anything that might come down to employer discrimination. They don't account for job, they don't account for background, they don't account for life choices, they don't account for any of that. They just break down hours worked, age, men, and women. But of course, we know so much more is going on. When we want to understand the gender pay gap, there are three crucial areas. There's motherhood, which we've seen very obviously from very liberal countries like Sweden, which have been very generous over the years with maternity pay and paternity pay. In Sweden, when they brought in shared parental leave, they saw that over 90% of women decided to take it up. And 20 years later, they changed the law because people weren't responding the way that they wanted to orchestrate other people's lives. So they brought in what was essentially forced dad leave. And use it or lose it. You would lose your benefits if dad didn't take a certain percentage of the time off. Even in this system, we still see the majority of women are choosing to take the time off. Different life choices connected to motherhood is a huge part of the gender pay gap. Career choices as well. In countless polls, countless studies, we see that women have different preferences in their working environments. They prefer more flexible working styles. They prefer friendlier colleagues. They prefer to have their weekends free. Men actively say that they want a more competitive environment. They say that they're happy to work 60, 70, 80 hours plus a week. They value different things. Now, we shouldn't stereotype. Doesn't mean that all women feel that way, and it doesn't mean all men feel that way, but we have to be honest about what the majority are saying to us because it helps us to understand their individual choices, which then get related to us in these kinds of statistics. It's also funny to me that people always assume that men are making the better choice, that the only success we can have on the gender pay gap is when women are making all the same decisions as men. Well, I mean, why not prioritize having a healthier work-life balance? That doesn't strike me as being a bad thing as long as everyone's happy doing it. The third, I think the third issue, which I think has the least impact on the gender pay gap but has to be discussed, is societal pressure. And the way in which certainly we still have expectations in 2018 that women will be the primary caretaker for children. And we have that expectation regardless of what someone's actually said. We just stereotype, we assume, we innately think that women will take up that role. Now, we have evidence that the majority of women want to, but that doesn't mean that every woman wants to. And there's some staggering stuff out there about how women will downplay what they hope to earn if they think they're meeting a potential life partner. They'll downplay how far they want to progress in their career. Women are twice as likely to feel financially guilty about going back to work because their salary can just about pay for childcare. Men are not as likely to feel that kind of guilt. So there are still issues here. It's not perfect. But none of the evidence suggests that the issue is employers and that women are being systematically discriminated against in the workplace. And yet, the government has decided that large companies with over 250 employees must publish their gender pay gap stats. This first came in April. It's going to happen every year. I don't know how you could have missed it. The media was just in absolute frenzy reporting on these companies with 50%, 60%, 70% gender pay gaps. The problem is that most of these calculations, I'd say 5 out of the 6, are meaningless. Genuinely meaningless. In terms of the first two about hourly pay, well, first of all, you shouldn't calculate means if you actually want to find an average. If you're actually trying to look to what the average man or woman is earning, leave the mean out of it, just look at the median. But they didn't break down job, they didn't break down age, they didn't break down background, they didn't break down anything meaningful, and most outrageously, they didn't even distinguish between full-time workers and part-time workers. I mean, this tells us absolutely nothing about men and women's earnings and whether or not they're fair. Similar arguments around the bonus, but they didn't actually take the person's salary into account, so you can't figure out the more meaningful calculation of whether or not the percentage of their bonus was related to their salary and how impressive that was. I would argue that a 2,000 pound bonus on 20,000 pounds a year is a lot more meaningful than a 2,000 pound bonus on 100,000 pounds a year. So it's very hard to see how the employer was actually rating that employee when they got the bonus. The worst one is proportion of males and females in each pay quartile. So it's just assumed that to have more women in your lower pay quartiles is a sexist bad thing to do. When we have more women graduating from university and graduating with master's degrees and PhDs, it is very strange to me that we would then criticize employers for hiring young women into startup roles and junior roles. The incentive here is to hire fewer women when they're coming out more qualified. What on earth was the government thinking, forcing companies to try to publish that data and shaming them when it came out? EasyJet's my favorite example. EasyJet published their gender pay gap of 52% pretty early on. And people just tore them apart. The headlines were awful, and you had to get to the 5th or 6th paragraph, or perhaps no paragraph at all, to discover that EasyJet pays their pilots, men and women, exactly the same, about $100,000 a year. But only 6% of their pilots are women. Now, some might say, well, why isn't EasyJet hiring more women? And the really easy answer is that they don't exist. Only 3% of pilots worldwide are thought to be women. So EasyJet's already hiring double the amount as the percentage worldwide. They started their own initiative back in October 2015 to recruit more female pilots using their own profit, their own time, their own staff to bring in more women, long before they had to publish their pay gap stat. They're doing everything they can to recruit more women, and they're paying them the same when they show up to the job. But you can't hire people that don't exist. And for some reason, all of EasyJet's attempts to work with women, to bring them in, and to recognize that they want more women in those senior roles and in those skilled roles has been deeply criticized. And I think it just goes to show the terrible state of affairs that we have right now when the conversation around the gender pay gap is to get the largest statistic possible and is to really try to downplay the success of women. And I think there's actually really a clear reason for this. And that's the fact that a lot of these campaign groups did very, very well for themselves financially and in terms of public support when women were having a tough time. And that makes sense, right? When there was a need for these groups to campaign about how women were being treated unfairly, they got the spotlight. But working women are doing very, very well now, and they don't feel that systematic discrimination because it's more or less been taken out of the workplace. And so these campaign groups are working very hard to hit the reset button. Forget the 9.1% gender pay gap or the negative 5.1% gender pay gap. They need to go back to 52% gender pay gaps. They need these companies reporting these figures. It's the only way that they continue to have legitimacy. It's the reason that the Equal Pay Day campaign leaves Northern Ireland out of its report. It's the reason you don't hear the success stories. It's because it's going to pan out badly for a few groups. But of course, the result is that it pans out really badly for women, especially young women. You know, we hear 11, 12-year-olds on the Victoria Derbyshire program talking about how they're scared to go into the workplace because they're going to be discriminated against. This is bad stuff. I don't understand any feminist campaign that would try to attack the psyches of kids like that. It's just awful. I'm going to conclude by flagging up the new statue in Parliament Square. Millicent Fawcett, as many of you probably know, went up earlier this spring as the first woman to take her rightful place there. I love walking past her every day to work because she was a genuine feminist campaigner. She believed strongly in women's rights. But what a lot of people, a lot of those groups, those victimhood mentality groups who put her statue up, what a lot of them don't know is that she was a classical liberal. Her book, Political Economy for Beginners, published in 1870, was about free markets, it was about trade, it was about individualism. And her individualism and her feminism was really wrapped up with her ideas around free enterprise. And it makes me happy, because I think a lot of people out there don't realize that she would be distraught to see the way that we calculate the gender pay gap today, and to see the way that statistics are distorted and used against women. And as an economist, I believe quite strongly that she would have recognized that the desired outcome of a gender pay gap is never going to be 0%. The only way to achieve a 0% gender pay gap is to prioritize equality of outcome over equality of opportunity. That requires a level of collectivism, socialism, state-run business to the extent that the UK has never seen, and let's hope we never do. People being forced into certain jobs, forced into working certain hours, having no control over their lives or their salaries or their negotiations or their success. A 0% gender pay gap is to completely eradicate the individual aspiring in the workforce. So we still have a lot of work to do in 2018. Women aren't equal, but as far as I'm concerned, the gender pay gap is a low, low priority because it's not affecting women in the way that a lot of these groups would like you to think. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm excited to take questions.